Okay, jumping in before we start the video. So this was scripted and recorded before I realized how soon the video would drop relative to the release of Duelist Nexus. The only change really is the inclusion of Purrely Noir and a couple of other extra deck swaps though. The profile itself has been updated accordingly, but there may be some mentions to cards no longer in the deck and referencing Purrely Noir as not out yet. So just understand there's a little weird time travel paradoxes going on. Anyway, enjoy the video. Hey y'all, what is up? Keasbey here, and today we're going to be looking at my very long delayed Purrely Deck Profile. But before we get into all that, don't forget to drop this video a like and subscribe to the channel for even more. Okay, so I'm going to put a timestamp in for anyone who wants to skip straight to the deck profile. Check the description below for that. Before that though, I just want to talk a little bit about what the limit to Delicious Memory did, why it hurt the deck, and what I think is the move going forward. I kind of want to highlight this so that if you want to put your own spin on this deck, it might help you see a different solve to what to do now that we don't have a guaranteed Purrely Noir on turn 1 anymore. All that said, the deck itself seems to be doing pretty well, still seeing competitive play, but it definitely isn't as strong as it could have been if it went unchecked. So yeah, 3 Delicious Memory almost every time gave you an Purrely Noir turn 1. If you aren't familiar with how Pearly works, we actually have a whole series talking through the basics of the deck, but to sum it up quickly, you have Pearly and Purrely Xyz monsters with unique effects that gain additional effects based on what quick play Pearly memory spells are attached to them as material. Each of the quick plays except Sleepy for now, as we are getting a 4th Pearly eventually, gives you access to a different Pearly monster from the extra deck. Delicious Memory gives us access to Pearly Plump, whose unique effect allowed us to attach 2 spells or traps from either graveyard to itself as material. The Pearlies then can be overlaid over an Pearly with 5 or more material. So if you resolve Plump, you already have 2 materials from its effect, Pearly makes a 3rd material, and the Delicious Memory used to summon it makes a 4th, meaning that you only need 1 additional material to attach to it. Whereas the other 2 Pearlies, you need a Pearly, 1 quick play to start, and then an additional 3 quick plays in hand, or to get lucky off of your additional Pearly summons and flip more quick plays to add to your hand. So yeah, Plump was the easiest bridge to get into Purrely Noir turn 1. Additionally, because of Plump's effect, we could afford to discard Pearly quick play spells to summon more Pearlies without losing them as potential materials, since we could attach up to 2 of them onto her later by her own effect. This means that we have a lot more flexibility with our cards in hand, plus the ability to build out boards beyond just a solo Purrely Noir. This also gave us more play in the draw phase to get around Droll and Lockbird, letting us resolve 2 quick plays, 3 if we open Delicious Memory, getting 2 to 3 summons, all while still in the draw phase, and all without losing any of the quick plays as potential Xyz materials. So obviously 3 down to 1 Delicious Memory greatly reduces the chances of opening it, but the other hit there is that we no longer have guaranteed access to it with Purrely. So in a basic scenario, we could, in the draw phase, use 2 quick plays, 1 for Purrely, 1 for Pearly. With Purrely, we then grab a copy of My Friend Pearly, and then maybe we get something off the other Pearly, but let's not factor that into this right now. So now we have 2 cards in hand, 2 Pearlies on field. We can then immediately use My Friend Pearly to reveal 3 copies of Delicious Memory that are all remaining in the deck, randomly, big air quotes there, get one of them, and fire it off. If we need an additional quick play, we can discard our last card in hand to go for another Pearly when we activate the Delicious Memory and try to get one. Or if the last card remaining itself is a quick play, we can go ahead and just attach it to the eventual Plump that we will make, get the 2 quick plays engraved as material, and make a Noir with the minimum 5 materials. Plus we have the 2 other Pearlies on field to make something like an Ensemble Robin. This is more or less a very low end of how this can go, and the hands generally meant much stronger. Check out the test hand video that we did a little while ago. They got really wild. Granted, we did have 3 Delicious Memory at that time. So the issue with this line of play now is that My Friend Pearly is not a guaranteed Delicious Memory. Since we only have 1 copy, it's all we can reveal, so at best we have a 1 in 3 chance of pulling it off of the My Friend effect. So we have to play accordingly and not be so flippant in the draw phase, meaning that Droll is much more impactful against us again now. Besides that, Delicious Memory itself is much more precious, since if it is DD crowed, we're out of it for good. Okay, so what about the other Pearlies? Well, Pretty Memory as a material allows you to send a card you control to the grave to attach an opponent's card as material. Granted, we can give this ability to any Purrely, but beauty is easier to make than plump at this point. Happiness allows you to search every time it battles, and if it's summoned via the Pearly effect, it will have at least 2 attacks on monsters, depending on how many happy memories you have going into the battle phase. Plus, you can always grab more happy memories, meaning more attacks, making it remarkably easy to get to 5 materials. And honestly, after all is said and done, we're an Xyz deck, so a 2 to 3 activation double Azalea is never out of the question. You may notice something though. Both of those above scenarios require our opponent to have a board. Well, guess what? We're going second deck now. Okay, to sum it up quickly, we're playing 11 hand traps backed by a few go second staples. We have 3 goals. 1, and most ideally, OTK via Purrely Happiness. Still very doable with 1 delicious memory, and even if we don't, we can still do a ton of damage and make Happiness into a big Purrely Noir. Goal number 2, make Purrely Noir, either via the Happiness route, attaching our opponent's cards via Pretty Memory and then continuing to attach more quick plays traditionally, or just doing the classic plump lineup as mentioned above if we do open the delicious memory or get access to it during the turn. And goal number 3, this is the least ideal version of it, but it does come up and it works pretty well. Chew through a bunch of our opponent's interactions, and then sneak an Xyz monster in afterwards, make a double Azalea, and use it to stall until we can get more Pearly resources. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get into the deck. First, we are on 3 copies of the original Pearly. Level 1 White Fairy with 100 over 100 and 2 effects. First, on normal or special summon, a trigger effect, you can excavate the top 3 cards of your deck and add 1 revealed Pearly spell or trap from among them to your hand, and then put the rest on the bottom of your deck in any order. Then, on an ignition effect, you can reveal a Pearly quick play spell in your hand and special summon the corresponding Xyz monster from your extra deck using both Pearly and the quick play as materials. Corresponding in this case means the Xyz monster will mention the name of the quick play in their effect. This second effect is a soft once per turn, so you can summon multiple Xyz monsters with multiple Pearlys, but more importantly, the first effect on Pearly to excavate has no once per turn on it at all, so every Pearly you normal or special summon, you can activate this effect. Bit of a funny note, you can actually activate this effect under Droll and Lockbird since adding a revealed Pearly card is optional. Obviously, you won't be able to add anything to hand, but on the off chance you want to cycle 3 cards from the top of your deck to the bottom while still under Droll, you do, funny enough, have that option. Next up, we are on 3 copies of Purrely, or Purrely Lily as it's called in the OCG, which is the name that I honestly prefer. Level 1 as well, Dark Fairy, 100 over 100 stats. Purrely Lily has 2 effects as well. On normal or special summon, she has a trigger effect to add any Pearly card from your deck to your hand except for a quick play, but this does include any other spell or trap, additional copies of itself, or even the original Pearly. Second, on ignition effect, you can target a Pearly quick play spell in your graveyard and overlay into the corresponding Xyz monster using Purrely Lily and the targeted quick play as material. Unlike the original Pearly, however, both of these effects are hard once per turn. Get it? It's important to manage both, but especially important in sequencing that you remember that you can summon multiple Xyz with the original Pearly, but only one with Purrely Lily, and that Pearly needs the quick play in the hand, while Lily needs it to be in the graveyard. Also important to be aware that while using the Xyz summon effect of Vanilla Pearly, you reveal the quick play and summon on resolution, meaning that, for example, if your opponent caused you to discard your intended quick play from hand, as long as you have another one, you can still Xyz into a different Purrely Xyz monster. Purrely Lily, on the other hand, targets the quick play on activation, so if the targeted quick play is banished or otherwise removed from the graveyard, Purrely Lily will resolve without effect, and again, hard once per turn on her summon effect. Overall though, she is a huge consistency boost for the deck that it desperately needed. That's it for the main deck Purrely monsters. Let's get into some hand traps. As mentioned before we started the profile, we're running a pretty large hand trap lineup. Our goal behind this is primarily to slow down our opponent, so with one exception, we are running mostly 1-for-1 trade hand traps, as we do want our opponent to have some field presence, but not enough to really hinder our plays. First off, we're on triple copies of Ash Blossom and Joy Spring, generically useful right now and has application against the majority of the meta at the moment. After that, we're looking at 2 copies of Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit. Sounds a little weird, but I really do like Ghost Ogre this format. Again, it has play in quite a few matchups, and again, we're looking at this more as something to lower the ceiling on an end board, not necessarily stopping it entirely. You could also run Effect Veiler in place of this as well for more monster effect negation, as Ghost Ogre doesn't actually negate monster effects. However, I like Ghost Ogre's versatility in dealing with some continuous and field spells and traps, such as in the Dragon Link or Fool on Deriz matchup, potentially limiting their possible plays depending on how they opened. And last, for our monster hand traps, we've got more coming later that aren't monsters. Triple copies of Droll and Lockbird. I think Droll is remarkably strong right now and can full-on shut down the turns of a few decks, and even some decks that can play through it still are forced to end on somewhat lower boards, which again is ultimately the goal of what we're trying to do with these. I know this feels counterintuitive given that we said we don't mind our opponent having a bit of a board, but there are some times where I would just prefer to stop a deck outright, and there's always the chance that our opponent has already normal summoned a Stratos type monster that will now sit on the field alone, leaving us with a very nice target to help us build our board from. That's it for the monsters. Let's get into our spells and traps. Kicking it off with the Pearly quick plays, let's start with the somewhat newly limited Purrely Delicious Memory. We've covered these in previous videos, but we'll talk about them a bit here as well. All 4 of the Purrely quick plays have the same effect setup. They have their primary effect on activation, a secondary effect that can be added to the resolution of them in which you discard a card and special summon a level 1 Pearly from the deck, and lastly the effect that they grant an Xyz monster while they are a material under that monster. Some general quick notes for the quick plays. Again, we covered these pretty in depth in my Pearly ruling video as well. If you want more information, definitely check that out. First, none of the primary effects on these target, most relevant for Delicious and Happy Memory. This comes up periodically, so just be aware of it. Next, because the modular effect to special summon a Pearly at resolution is always potentially available at activation, all of these memory cards can be hit with Ash, nullifying the entire effect. However, because the discard happens at resolution, 2 very big things to be aware of. First and foremost, if your opponent does Ash Blossom your memory spell, you never reach the point at which you are discarding, and if you do reach that point where you are going to discard, it is past the point where your opponent can use Ash, since again, the discard and summon are all part of the resolution of this card. It is important to know that if you have reached that point, your opponent now can't add Ash to the chain because the chain is already resolving. Just be aware so that it doesn't come up and you get messed up out of getting a Pearly summon. Next, again, since the discard is part of the resolution of the effect, it is not considered a cost, rather part of the effect. Therefore, something like a Dark World effect will trigger. This is relevant to older builds of the deck, but we're no longer running any of the Dark World cards for the moment. Lastly, the effects that are granted by these, when they are materials, are all considered separate effects. So they stack, but let's put air quotes around stack. Spoilers for a later quick play. Pearly Sleepy Memory, when used as a material, allows you to draw a card during your opponent's standby phase. So for example, if you had 2 Sleepy Memories attached, you would draw 2 cards. However, this is not an effect that says draw 2 cards, rather 2 separate effects that each say draw 1 card. This is most relevant to Sleepy Memory and Pretty Memory, but that means that if your opponent does Ash your first Sleepy Memory effect, they will only be stopping 1 draw, not 2, and then you can go ahead and use that second identical draw 1 effect. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's talk about Delicious Memory. Its effect allows you to choose 1 monster. Again, this does not target, so the monster is chosen at resolution, and that monster cannot be destroyed by battle until the end of the next turn. This is full battle protection no matter how many times the monster would be destroyed, and it is not limited to our own monsters, which is very relevant to an OTK line this deck has fairly consistent access to, but we'll talk about that more later. When attached as a material, it grants the Xyz monster 300 attack and defense for every material attached to it. Only really relevant in the mirror match at this point, but if you can attach multiple copies of it, you will have 2 separate but identical effects granting the same 300 per material boost, so essentially it will be treated as 600 per material. But again, mostly in reference to Sleepy and Pretty Memory, it is important to remember that these are all treated as separate but identical effects. Delicious Memory is our bridge to go into Pearly Plump. Following that, we are on 3 copies of Purrely Happy Memory. Happy Memory's effect allows you to choose a card on the field, and the next time it would be destroyed by card effect until the end of the next turn, it is not. This is becoming very relevant with Eradicator Epidemic Virus floating around, letting us protect our continuous spell if we need to when we get hit with that. Just remember, unlike Delicious Memory, this is a one-time only protection within the given time frame. When used as a material, it grants the monster an additional attack on monsters for each copy of Happy Memory attached to it. So for example, 2 Happy Memories means you have your base attack on a monster, and then 2 more additional attacks on monsters afterwards. More on this in the ruling video, but the most important thing to be aware of is that the attacks are only for monsters. So if you have 1 Happy Memory and destroy your opponent's only monster, you will not be granted an additional attack to hit indirectly. You are also not limited to attacking different monsters and can attack the same monster multiple times. Say for example, if your opponent has a monster that you gave battle protection to via Delicious Memory, you could attack it repeatedly. Happy Memory is our bridge to go into Purrely Happiness. Next up, we are on 3 copies of Purrely Pretty Memory. Pretty Memory gives both players 1000 life points. It is one of our 2 ideal starter quick plays since it can be used into a totally empty board if we go first, or if we drolled our opponent and they ended immediately, whereas Delicious and Happy Memory do need something on the field to grant their protections to. When used as a material, it grants the Xyz monster a soft once per turn effect to send a card you control to the graveyard as cost, to target a card your opponent controls, and attach it to the Xyz monster as material. While unfortunately it does target, this is absolutely amazing as removal, dodging the majority of floating effects and giving you more cards stacked under the Xyz monster. Now, what I was saying before really comes into play here. If you have 2 copies of Pretty Memory, you have a monster that has 2 effects that both read as above, meaning if you have 2 cards to send as cost, you can attach 2 cards your opponent controls as material. Following that, if on the same turn you overlay your initial Purrely into an Purrely, those effects will actually reset, meaning if you have 2 cards to send as cost, you can attach 2 more cards your opponent controls as material. This effect is one of the reasons we want to go second and have our opponent have some kind of board. While not as strong as adding materials as Plump's native effect, this one can speed up the process of getting our 5 materials to get into an Purrely, or worst case, it gives us additional activations on a double Azalea while potentially removing cards that we don't want to send to our opponent's graveyard via an effect. Pretty Memory is our bridge to get into Purrely Beauty. And lastly, we are on 3 copies of Purrely Sleepy Memory. Sleepy Memory's effect is to nullify the next battle or effect damage you would take during this turn. It is our other ideal starter, as again, it can be used into a completely empty board. When used as a material, it grants the monster the effect that during your opponent's standby phase, you can draw a card. I used it as my example for how these effects stack and build, so I'll only just re-mention that if you have 2 of these and your opponent ashes the first effect, you would still have a separate draw 1 effect to use after the first one is negated. Additionally, if you use Pearly to go into a new Purrely during your opponent's standby phase, similar with Pretty Memory, you will now have 2 fresh effects to draw after Purrely Leap resolves. The more access you have to Sleepy Memory, the more adventurous you can get with discarding cards in your hand, and as we play 8 hand traps that can be fired off from the hand outside of an empty board, we have fairly good odds of replacing them. Purrely Sleepy Memory doesn't currently have an Xyz monster associated with it in the TCG, but in the OCG it gives us access to Purrely Noir, which will absolutely be seeing play when it comes out in the TCG. Just a note, I feel you need to be playing the max amount of any of the quick plays that you can to give you the best odds of opening them and finding them off of Purrely's Excavate effect. Following that, we're on 3 copies of My Friend Pearly. My Friend Pearly has 2 effects. First, you can pay 500 life points, and as mentioned in the introduction to this video, reveal 3 Pearly cards, and have your opponent randomly add one of them to your hand, shuffling the other 2 into the deck. Again, it is very important to note you can reveal 3 copies of the same card, taking the randomness out of the equation. Next, if a Purrely Xyz monster, Purrely or Purrely leaves the field because of an opponent's card, you can add up to 3 Purrely quick play spells with different names from your graveyard to your hand. A few very important notes about this. First, because of an opponent's card does include kaijus and battle, but it does exclude something like evenly matched that affects the player, causing them to take an action. Additionally, you can force this effect by attacking into a larger monster and having one of your Purrely Xyz monsters be destroyed by battle. As again, battle counts, the effect can be used during the damage step. Next, the effect to recover the quick plays does not target and is up to 3. So something like DD Crow, hitting one of them will not cause the effect to resolve improperly, and for example, if you have one of each of all 4 and they DD Crow on the activation, you won't lose out on getting a full 3 since the choice is happening on resolution, not activation. Both of these effects are hard once per turns, however the activation of this card itself is not, which is very relevant. A, because if your opponent removes it before you've used the effect and you have 2, you can activate the second copy, then use the effect. And B, if you resolve the first effect, you can activate a second copy of this card from hand, then with 2 of them on the field, use one of them as a cost for Pearly Pretty Memories granted effect, while still retaining 1 on the field for its recovery effect if your opponent later removes your Purrely Xyz monster from the field. 3 copies of this, as we always want to open it, freeing up our Purrely Lily search for either Purrely Yeep, trap card, or our next card. And that is 1 copy of the field spell, Purrely Stray Street. Stray Street is a card that I admittedly absolutely slept on when the archetype came out, but it's really proven since then why it is so good. So Stray Street does a lot. First, it grants targeting protection to any Purrely monster during the turn that they are special summoned, from main deck to Xyz. Given that Imperm and Veiler both target and are brutal on our little cats, shutting off both their search and ability to summon. Next, during the end phase, you can target a Purrely Xyz monster on the field, and then attach a Purrely Quick Play spell from either your deck or graveyard to it as material. This works during both your and your opponent's end phase. Interestingly enough, you can actually attach to your opponent's Xyz Purrely monsters, which could, in theory, if you have a way to immediately clear the Xyz monster, be a way to turbo into one of your own quick plays, but I think that's a bit of a pipe dream, but you know me, always worth mentioning that you can do it. And lastly, we have a recovery effect here as well, same as my friend Pearly. If your Purrely Xyz monster leaves the field because of an opponent's card, you can special summon a level 1 Pearly from either your deck or graveyard. Really interesting, this is actually a mandatory effect, so you must resolve it if possible. Again, similar to my friend Pearly, you can trigger this recovery effect in the damage step. I don't think we need to play Terraforming for this card, as good as it doesn't do anything to jumpstart our plays, but rather is a nice to have for when your plays get going, or a good Lily search if you've already opened my friend. Okay, let's get into the going second cards. We're on 2 copies of Triple Tactics Thrust. Again, still a very solid card right now, giving us access to everything that is coming up, with the bonus of letting us grab a Purrely Yeep as well if we don't need anything else. Again, reminder, this counts at any point during your turn, unlike Triple Tactics Talent, which is only during the main phase, but your opponent must control a monster for you to add the card to your hand, otherwise it can only be set to the field and cannot be used during the turn it's set. Overall, this card does put in a ton of work. Next up, 2 copies of the aforementioned Triple Tactics Talents. So generally speaking, you're going to be using this to check your opponent's hand for further interaction if they, for example, Ash Blossom your My Friend Pearly or Pearly monsters. But in very desperate case, or if your opponent doesn't have a hand, the draw to effect isn't bad, at minimum giving you more fodder to discard for your Pearly quick plays. You can also, if you're going for an OTK, borrow a monster your opponent controls for additional damage, but remember, our main OTK line does require our opponent to have a monster, so again, most likely you'll just be using this to snipe a card out of your opponent's hand here. Next up, we're on 2 copies of Lightning Storm. We're mostly using this to clear back row, but it does come up sometimes that you need to wipe out some problematic monsters. And lastly, we're on 2 copies of Dark Ruler No More. This may seem counterintuitive in a deck that I mentioned that one of the win conditions is OTKing, but in cases where you can't do that, this can clear the way to either make a very big Noir or a very big AA Zeus. AA Zeus especially being able to clear a negated board while it is still under Dark Ruler No More and have remaining activations afterwards. Something else worth noting as well, Dark Ruler No More does not make Purrely Happiness useless here. As we'll cover later, Happiness halves the attack of a monster on field after it searches after it battles, so you can actually clear quite a few monsters on the field with just Happiness alone, while building up your searches and eventually being able to get into an Purrely Noir afterwards. This Thrust search suite that we're running is mostly about having varied options for different scenarios that can come up. Next, the traps. First, we're on 1 copy of Pearly Yeep. Pearly Yeep lets you target a Purrely Xyz monster you control and special summon a Purrely Xyz monster with a different rank on top of it, transferring all materials over. So basically you can go from a rank 2 to a rank 7 or a 7 back down to a 2. There's a lot of interesting cheeky plays that you can do with this, such as loading up a plump with more materials, then going back into a Noir afterwards. It's mostly being used to get bonus draws in your opponent's standby phase, but again, remember that you can use this to tag out for other reasons as well. Also, it can be a very useful tool in OTKing, letting you toggle into a different Purrely for additional damage, or go up to an Purrely Happiness for insane amounts of damage. Next, this card can be banished from the graveyard as cost to target up to 3 Pearly monsters in your graveyard, including XCs if you want to do that, and return them to the deck. Solid recovery to have in place, especially if you overextend or your opponent snipes out one of your important Pearly XCs monsters from the extra deck early. Again, as previously mentioned, if you go first, it's not a bad target for Thrust. Lastly, the Xyz monster you summon with this is returned to the extra deck at the end of the next turn. And closing out the main deck, we are on 3 more hand traps in the form of 3 copies of Infinite Impermanence. You could also play 3 copies of Effect Veiler here, given that if we draw these off of a Sleepy Memory effect, they are offline, but I like it here as you do have a bit of versatility in that you can fire this off early from your hand during your turn, or set it if you are going first to potentially lock out a spell trap column. Alrighty, that's it for the main deck. Time for the extra deck. So let's go ahead and kick this off. We are back on the Link 1 Relinquished Anima. Overall, I just like this card. Again, it punishes bad placement of monsters, but it can also just eat a negation so we can potentially go off afterwards. Any of our Pearlies can make it, so it's a very easy include here. And another new inclusion, we are on Striker Azalea. So Azalea is serving more or less the exact same purpose as Agent of the Moon was in our previous builds, with a few differences. First, let's get the main downside out of the way. If you summon her, after her on-summon effect resolves, she will send herself to the graveyard. No real benefit there for us. But all the good stuff now. So first, on summon, you can target a card on the field and destroy it. Given that generally we were tributing our own agent to pop a card, we're breaking even here at the bare minimum. Now, from here forward, Azalea becomes a strict improvement. Her materials are just 2 light and or dark monsters, meaning we can actually go into Anima first, potentially snatch up a monster, and then link climb into her to pop something else on the field. Not guaranteed obviously, but good to be aware that we can do this when the situation arises. We can also link off our Nibiru if we side that in, though I'm kind of considering maining it, and then pop the big token we probably gave our opponent, which has been an issue in the past with some hands that this deck does put up. We can also, since we are maining triple tactics talents, potentially use an opponent's monster as material if it fits the criteria, which is pretty inclusive, to clear it so that it never gets to go back home. And lastly, once per turn, if this card battles an opponent's monster, at the start of the damage step you can banish a spell from your graveyard to destroy the opponent's monster. Given that we have a good amount of generic spells, we will generally have ammo for this. Overall, she's just a strict improvement over Agent of the Moon, and Anima is just a little bonus to include that makes her link climb even better. Now for the really good stuff, let's talk about the Pearly XCs monsters. We're going to start with the 3 Purrelys, beginning on Purrely Plump. So like the quick plays, the Purrelys have a shared effect setup. 1 unique effect, 1 effect that attaches activated quick plays to it alongside an associated effect that can be resolved on the same chain link, more details on the importance of how those resolve coming later, and lastly a modifier if their associated quick play is used as a material. Last thing I want to mention before going into the individual monsters is that they are all rank 2s and can be made with a traditional XC summon, but this specific build cannot do that. So starting with Plump, we have the soft once per turn unique effect to target up to 2 spells and traps in either graveyard and attach them to herself as material. You can mix and match as well and attach 1 from each graveyard if you would like to do so. The modifier is that if Delicious Memory is a material, this becomes a quick effect. Now to talk about the attachment effect here. Again, more in depth on this in the rulings video, but I will go into the details here that are important. When you activate a Pearly Quick Play, you can activate this effect, attach the Quick Play as a material, then resolve an optional portion of the effect afterwards. So first thing you may notice is the when at the start of the effect. This attachment effect must be used directly in response to the Quick Plays, otherwise you will miss timing and not get the chance to activate the Quick Play as material. Not as tragic with Plump, as you can still potentially attach it as a material from the graveyard via her unique effect. Then the bonus effect. When you attach a Quick Play to Plump, via its on activation of a Quick Play attachment effect, not attaching from the graveyard, just keep that in mind, you can non-target banish a monster on field until the end of the turn. So none of these on attachment effects for any of our Purrelys target, and your opponent must respond to them not just before you decide what you want to banish, but before they even know if you will be activating the bonus effect at all. This is because, like the effects to summon Pearly from the quick plays, it happens as the chain is already resolving and new activations cannot be added to the chain. So just to highlight, if you go Chain Link 1, a memory card, and Chain Link 2, Plump to attach, your opponent then declines to respond. They cannot chain Infinite Impermanence to the Banish effect now since the chain is already resolving, and they would have had to have decided on Chain Link 3 if they wanted to interact. On all of our Purrelys, this attachment effect is a soft thrice per turn. Plump, as mentioned up top, is the easiest route to our Purrelys, especially when going first or into an empty board from our opponent. One last thing to mention about all the Purrelys, it is very important to be aware that these are all soft once or thrice per turn effects, so if your opponent clears your Plump after it's already attached from the graveyard and you can go into another copy of it, not particularly difficult if you have the continuous spell, even easier if you have that and the field spell, you now have a fresh once per turn on attaching to the grave and 3 fresh attaching quick play effects to it and potentially banishing afterwards. Okay, next up, 2 Purrely Beauties. Beauty's unique effect is to target a monster your opponent controls, negate its effect. Modifier is this becomes a quick play if your beauty has a pretty memory attached to it as a material. This is kind of the de facto backup monster if you need to go first and don't have access to Plump, giving you at very least a negation, potentially recovery if you have the continuous and field spell as well, backed up by our hand traps, but it's not ideal. Its thrice per turn attachment effect is a non-targeted battle position shift of an opponent's monster. This actually does come up, more so as a mechanic teamed up with Purrely Happiness to either OTK or at least amass a ton of resources. Obviously as well, if you summon Beauty properly, you will have the associated effect to send a card you control to the graveyard as cost to attach a monster your opponent controls as a material, putting you at 3 materials, meaning that you only need 2 more materials to get into an Purrely. And lastly, my favorite, Purrely Happiness. Happiness breaks the mold a little bit in its unique effect being a trigger effect instead of an ignition, so we'll cover that in a moment as there is a lot to say about it. Its on attachment effect is much simpler, just a non-targeted bounce of an opponent's back row to the hand. Okay, so let's cover the unique effect. Now, going into this, it is important to know that if you summon this properly, you will have a happy memory attached, meaning that you have 2 attacks on monsters going into the battle phase. When she battles, after damage calculation, you can add any Pearly card from your deck to your hand. There is no once per turn attached to this effect, only limited by how many times you can attack. Then the modifier. If you have happy memory as a material, you can non-targeting half the attack of an opponent's monster on field permanently. Also very important to know, this is current attack, so it stacks, meaning after 2 activations, you've actually quartered the attack of an opponent's monster. So to sum it up quickly, if your opponent has 2 monsters and your Happiness can survive its first attack, you have the start of the Purrely Happiness OTK, attacking something you can survive the attack with, then grabbing Delicious Memory and having something else's attack that's in attack position. Also worth noting, since this happens in the damage step, it cannot be hit with Ash Blossom. Then you can use Delicious Memory to force battle protection on that now halved monster and use your first of 3 attachment effects to attach the Delicious Memory to Happiness, boosting its attack. Now use your second attack, hit him for damage, grab another copy of Happy Memory. Attach the memory, get another attack, then do it again. This will be your last attachment for the turn, leaving you with either 1 more attack to win the game, or leaving you with a 5 material Happiness, plus a final search for either the field spell or the trap, depending on what you need there, and a ton of damage dealt. If Noir isn't your flavor here, you can also just make a 3 activation double Azalea as well. Happiness is honestly most of the reason we're trying to run a go second build now, giving us so much access to anything we need, a very easy route to Purrely Noir or a big double Azalea, or just the ability to win the game outright. So let's look at our newest include. We are on 1 copy of Purrely Noir. So Noir's native effect is that on a soft once per turn, you can discard a card from your hand and target a card your opponent controls, up to 2 if you have Sleepy Memory as a material, and bounce them back to the hand. Overall, pretty solid. It does target though, unfortunately, but still, not too bad, especially in a blind second build. It can either be used to clear or force out negates early, and if the negation also destroys her, if we've got our field spell and continuous spell up, we do get some nice recovery on top of forcing that negation. Unfortunately as well, this effect is not a quick effect, but still, again, it's really not too bad. Its on attachment effect is very solid, letting you set up a Pearly trap directly from the deck, giving us some additional play around from Droll and Lockbird. We aren't playing Purrely Sharely, as while I think it's a fun card, I don't quite find that it does enough or really benefit our specific build too much, but having more access to Purrely Yeep is never a bad thing. We get to her via Sleepy Memory, which is another huge bonus in and of itself, letting us, if need be, start our Xyz building off with a Sleepy Memory, something that we could not do before, and combined with her effect to set Purrely Yeep directly from the deck, giving us more solid Purrely Noir access, she is a very welcome include to the deck. Alright, next up, the two Purrelys. We'll start with Purrely Happiness. These are both rank 7s that share a summoning condition, as previously mentioned, to overlay a rank 2 monster with 5 or more materials under it. This doesn't have to be a Pearly, but I don't know if that's ever going to be relevant, and you can make these with 2 level 7s as well if you'd like, but again, well, you know, just good to know. Next, they both gain modifiers to their effects based on if they currently have 5 or more materials under them, and if they have a level 1 Pearly as a material. So Purrely Happiness has the effect that you can detach a material from it to negate the effects of all monsters your opponent currently controls. If you have a level 1 Pearly as a material, this effect cannot be responded to, so basically a walking Dark Ruler no more with no damage prevention. This doesn't come up overly often, as generally if you can make it to an Purrely Happiness, there aren't any relevant effects, but it does come up here and there and is very good to be aware of. Next, when an attack is declared involving this card, if it has 5 or more materials, hit your opponent for 1500 points of effect damage. Okay, this counts if it's attacked or attacking, which has come up in a very funny win very recently. There is no once per turn on this effect, or the previous one for that matter actually, meaning that you can get multiple attacks via Happy Memory, and then each one of those is going to hit for 1500 points of effect damage, in addition to whatever battle damage you are also hitting with. You won't make this monster overly often, but it is very good to know that you have it in your back pocket, especially off of a plump if you need to get in some major damage, as it can add up if you have multiple attack position targets, or one that is protected by Delicious Memory, on top of the stat boost from the Delicious Memory itself. Alrighty, now for the towers, Purrely Noir. Noir has the effect to detach into materials, target a card your opponent controls or in their graveyard, and spin it to the bottom of the deck. Amazing non-destruction removal with no once per turn attached to it. Additionally, this is a quick effect if you have a level 1 Pearly monster as a material. So if you make this properly, with the bare minimum materials needed, you will have 3 activations of this, which is incredible as far as disruption goes. Next, if it has 5 or more materials, it is unaffected by your opponent's activated effects. There's a lot here, so I'm going to again refer you to the rulings video for a full explanation of activated versus non-activated effects, but major players that this is unaffected by are things like Dark Ruler no more, Infinite Impermanence, etc. Something important to keep in mind is if you have 6 materials, for example, the activation cost of using this effect is detaching the materials, so your opponent could chain Imperm to your now 4 material Noir to negate it. Though in this case, you can shotgun out the remaining bounce effects since it is not only non-once per turn, it's non-once per chain as well. Overall, this card is incredibly strong and one of the major win conditions of this deck, but not the only one for sure. Moving into our generic Xyz, we've got 1 copy of Sylvan Princess Sprite. She has an effect relevant to plants that we don't need to worry about, but relevant, you can detach a material from her, excavate the top card of the deck, and if it's a spell or trap, add it to your hand. Otherwise, send it to the graveyard. It's a bit of a gamble, but it comes up here and there. Also, it's an Xyz with a fairly large attack stat, so you have another backup route to double Azalea if you need it. Plus, if you need that extra bit of push for an Happiness OTK, this does come up as a pretty nice last attack. Next up, we have 1 copy of Downer Magician. One guess why we're on this. And our backup win condition, 2 copies of double Azalea. So Zayas is just a remarkable fallback plan if we say chew through a lot of interruptions and can still land 1 Xyz monster. Important to know that you can make a double Azalea over an existing double Azalea, so we're running 2 here as a way to reload a 1 material double Azalea into a fresh 2 material one. Also of note, if we Purrely Yeep into an Xyz and want to keep the materials under something instead of going to the graveyard, we can just drop a double Azalea over it as well. Also, if we use one of our main deck monsters to hit into an opponent's Xyz, then make an Xyz monster on our side of the field afterwards, or just take our opponents with triple tactics talent, we can always overlay that into a double Azalea as well. Alright, that's it for the extra deck. Let's talk about the side deck. As always, tailor your side deck to the specific event you're going to, but this has been my working side deck for me right now, and I've been liking it. Let's start with double copies of Nibiru the Primal Being. So this comes in some matchups where we need a bit of extra disruption, or single-use hand traps might not do quite enough. The nice thing is, it generally guarantees us a nice defense position monster to hit with Happiness to get our plays started from there, and then that gives us options to go into afterwards. I had it in the main deck, but I shifted some stuff around from the side to main just to get a little more overall coverage in the main deck, but it was never bad in there. I'm kind of back and forth on the ratios at the moment that would involve getting this back into the main, but for the moment I think it's perfectly comfortable in the side deck where it is. Next up, we've got some cool spice in 2 copies of Vanity's Fiend. So this comes in mostly for going first once our opponent knows our game plan. So it does lock us pretty hard into just one Pearly, but it also fully prevents our opponent from going too far into their own plays unless they address the vanities. The main thing we're playing this for though is to protect our Purrely Noir from kaiju, since this prevents their special summon. Overall it's been very strong, and if we do have access to the pretty memory effect on our given Pearly, we can always clear our own vanity by sending it as cost to attach our opponent's monsters or cards in general as material. Next up, we're on 3 copies of Denka. So 3 might be a bit of overkill, but I run into a lot of Labyrinth. We can 100% slam this down for our normal summon into a full back row, and shy of our opponent having a counter to the actual summon of Denka itself, like Solemn Judgment, we're golden to start special summoning Pearlies without having to deal with our opponent's back row. We don't really need to set anything past this point as well, so we can go to town without fear of getting hit with a set imperm or anything like that. Again, 3 of this might be a little bit of overkill, but I like having the extra access to it. Next up, 1 copy of Feather Duster. This is why I'm feeling that the 3 Denka might be a bit of overkill, but I do like it as an option for decks that aren't strictly back row, but use back row or have in-archetype negates or interruptions, such as Sword Soul or Sprite. Most relevant with Sprite, if you can bait out the Carrot negate with Storm, we can grab this with Thrust to break the back row. It comes up here and there, and I've actually considered maining it, but Pearly has a lot of playthrough power against random smatterings of back row, so the 2 Lightning Storms in the main have kind of felt like enough so far. Following that, 2 Cosmic Cyclones. This is specifically for decks that have random floodgates like Skill Drain, etc. teched in as a quick answer to them. Also solid for going first into anything that uses any sort of continuous spells or traps or field spells. 1000 life points isn't actually really a cost with this deck, mostly due to pretty memory, but keep an eye on time, as while we balance our life points internally, our opponent does gain 1000 for free. Next up, some more cards good for if we have to go first. We're on 3 copies of Summon Limit. This is similar to Vanities in that we can play a turn, establish our board, and then play under our own Summon Limit very easily. We can actually accomplish quite a lot in just 2 summons, and similar to with our Vanity's Fiend, we could actually just clear it out pretty easily via the pretty memory effect. Additionally, if we do get hit with a kaiju, that will eat into one of our opponent's only 2 summons for the turn. And last but not least, 2 copies of Solemn Judgment. I am testing 3 of this while dropping down to 2 Denka as well. I just overall like Solemn as a go first option, as just a be-all end-all answer to a ton of different threats, dealing with cards like Dark Ruler no more, or stopping a combo at an important summon. Again, just watch out for time, as we can gain our life points back and protect ourselves from damage if we need to, but we will still be behind our opponent after resolving one of these. So that's it for the deck. I've been having a really good run of it, and honestly, the forced variety into the playstyle by virtue of having less access to a turn 1 Noir has actually been a lot of fun. I know I slowly turn everything into a go second deck, but I actually think it does make a lot of sense with Pearly, given the tools that we have at our disposal, and again, the limited turn 1 access to Noir into an open board if we fail to find Delicious Memory. Some notable cards that I didn't include in here are the Dark World and Crystal Beast engines. I think a condensed version of the Dark World engine could work. I had been testing out 2 Snow and 1 Brow, and even just 2 Brows, but I haven't really felt them missing that often. But if you do want to veer more towards a going first style of deck, they are great for managing your resources overall and keeping cards in hand. But again, this is really only relevant if you have Delicious Memory in rotation, or a critical mass of quick plays to use. The Rainbow Bridge engine is still solid access to the field spell as well, but I've always kind of preferred the Dark World engine, and I'm not even using that anymore. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to drop it a like and subscribe to the channel for even more, and I will catch you all later.